Hokey. How I got it right, have I?
Yeah, hi Dermot.
Hello, folks. How you doing? Are you all together? That's great.
Yes,
Yeah, we're all three together.
we're all three together. I know you know Adrian. I'm Mary. We've exchanged emails, and I
Have indeed.
Dermot, right?
Yeah.
Not Mr. Bolger.
Not Mr. Bolger. That's not Mr. Bolger. No.
And this is Joyce, Joyce East. She's
Nice to meet you.
my co-coordinator of this Irish book group, and
Hello. Nice to meet you, guys.
we are so happy that you've agreed to this, so that we can, pose some questions to you. And
I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be there, but having to leave my living room as well. So it just couldn't get any better, you know.
Well, the first question, as the three of us talked before we got you on screen, was that how do you get an idea, and when you get an idea to write something, how do you decide if it's going to be a novel, a short story, or a poem? Is there?
That's a good question. The American songwriter Sammy Cahn was once asked what came first, the music or the lyrics, and he said the phone call. And very often the phone call can influence things. To take the first story in this book, in London in 1986 or so, somebody I knew from school gave me a loan of their bed set for the night in London. And the bed set on it had nothing in it. And the landlord smashed the door down looking for 6 months back rent. And I walk into this weird situation. And I was, wouldn't it be amazing if this guy wrote my books and I was secretly publishing them? You know, I mean, it was just an idea, which I forgot about for the next 28 years or so, until one day the BBC phoned up and said, we're doing this sequence of short stories called about like the person you would least like to meet in some situation, like going on holidays and discovering that your next door neighbor was in the next room or something. And immediately I said, that idea I had back in 1987 in Havant, its moment has arrived. And so a lot of stories in this book, they were moments that were lurking in my mind, and then BBC or the Irish Times or Faber or somebody would phone me up and say, we're doing a book of short stories. But with as someone who basically, I'm just a storyteller, and I tell stories, and sometimes poems are different because you're walking at night and a poem mugs you. Because Yeats said that out of the because we out of the quarrel with other people we make rhetoric, and out of the quarrel with ourselves we make poetry. And so because you're washing dishes or walking the dog or doing whatever you're doing, there's a discourse in your mind, and one of those thoughts sparks with sudden electricity, and you just know that's the opening line of a poem, and you've got to get it down. So poems come very differently to you. Whereas with novels and plays, it depends on. Sometimes you want to tell an entire story, and you create an entire fictional universe, and you you write a novel. Novel might be 200 or 500 pages long. I remember like walking my dog at night. My dog has now died, but I thought I couldn't write anymore when my dog died, because I got all my days walking him and occasionally kicking him. But I was walking my dog down a little side street in Drumcondra in Dublin, and there was a skip outside a house. And you know, skips are normally filled with rubbish, but this was filled with rubbish, and the top layer, the top foot of it, was old papers from the attic. Somebody hadn't cleared out the attic, and there were Valentine cards from the 1950s, most innocent Valentine cards, and all kinds of strange religious books that you did at school about how to prepare the house. If a priest was coming, if someone died in the bedroom, it's really strange stuff to me. So I did what any self-respecting writer would do. I tied my dog to the skip at 2 o'clock in the morning. I climbed into the skip and I sat there reading all the papers for the next hour. And I just knew that it was a play. Because these were all the school books and the Valentine cards and letters of a 15-year-old girl. And I knew her name was April Bright. And I just wanted to tell one day in her life. and she was going to die of TB. I sort of felt, this whole story came to me, and I didn't want to write a whole novel. I just felt, no, I want her to be vibrant on that stage. And so that was just a play. And sometimes a book becomes a novel, and sometimes it becomes a short story.
Sure.
I have a general question, Dermot. I mean, all the writers have had to deal with, with the COVID, with lockdown, and no audience, no readings, no book signings, no festivals. And I think it seems to have affected different people differently, obviously. Like, I mean, how did it affect you with your creative process? Did you find yourself working just as much or less, or working in a different way?
I found myself walking more. You've got to set ambitions. I set the ambition of growing my hair back. I failed miserably in that ambition. But I actually I was lucky in that I had 3 plays in the Abbey in succession. The Abbey is Ireland's national theatre, and I had a version of James Joyce's Ulysses, and James had a relationship where he would take the credit and I'd take the royalties, and that was solved a few financial problems for a year or two. And I did a play about the Dublin Docks. So I actually had, and then they were going to bring my play back about the Dublin Docks, and then they said, we can't do 4 plays in a row. So I was really lucky in that I had these memories of being in a theatre of like 448 people packed out night after night and standing amongst. It seems so weird now because I haven't actually been at any gig. I've seen 2 of my plays performed on Zoom in the last year, but I was lucky in the sense that there were loads of writers whose plays were due into the Abbey that year, and they were all cancelled. And there's a backlog of plays, and people who have spent like 10 years writing a novel on New Ireland that I'm involved with, a publisher. They published some really, really fine debut novels, and the people never got to have a book launch, and they must have imagined one day launching their book. And so I actually just put the head down and I kept writing, and I actually walked the streets at night. And I actually, the first thing I used to write was poems. And I actually began to write poems again because I began to be mugged by the silence on the streets. And so the poems weren't about the pandemic. The poems were just about thoughts that came to me. They were about my life and other people's lives. And I have a book coming out in 2 weeks' time called Other People's Lives, which is all those poems written during the pandemic. And so my response was just to go into my imagination and relive my own life and other people's lives in that silence.
One of the other questions that one of our readers in our group submitted to there, that several of the stories have authors as the main character. And we were just commenting before that we just love that last line in the first short. First story. Okay, I'll sign up. That is right up there with round up the usual suspects. Okay, but and then the last story deals with an author. Anything autobiographical in either of them?
Not really. It's funny. There was a poet. She's not a young poet anymore. She's 55. She lives in America, called Sarah Berkeley, who's a really, really fine poet.
Oh yeah, we had her here. Yeah, the Irish Culture Centre a few years ago.
Had you? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And so, Sarah sent me a walk when she was 15, and I brought her to lunch. And I brought a chaperone because I mean I was only 22, but I still felt it should be that type of. I wanted because she was just so young, and but the poems were brilliant. Only Michael Hartnett, another Irish poet who's dead now, began as a complete poet. From the teenage years. But I gave Sarah a list of rules, and one of the rules was never to write about writers. And I actually kept this rule. So I've written 14 novels where there isn't a single writer in sight, and numerous plays, no writers in sight. But this time around, I actually wanted to write about the experience of being a writer, which is quite interesting. So I deliberately wrote 2 stories, that first story, and then this really strange story called The Rivals. And it only had the smallest amount of autobiography, in that when I was around 17, there was another local poet whose name I can't remember, and we met once in a pub. And like 10 years later, I met somebody on a bus and they said, I believe you and so are bitter rivals, and sort of, and it took me, I remember it took me around 5 days to figure out who this person actually was talking about. And so I actually just loved the notion, but Dizzy, as I'm now 63 and a quarter, and I find that people stop me on the street regularly and they tell me the most amazing stories about myself, but that are totally untrue, but they're convinced they're true. And half of them actually happened to Dermot Healy, who's the other Dermot who had a more exciting and adventurous life than me. And I find that there's all these myths go up. So I just love the notion. Again, going when somebody asked, the BBC asked me for a story, I just love the notion of somebody who was convinced that there was a 40-year long rivalry between two writers who had nothing in common. And then, you know, because I remember I was in this castle in Italy a few years ago, and there was an American there writing a book. And she had the whole thing like planned out all the way. And she was worrying about the last chapter. And I said, well, have you actually written the first chapter? I said, no, I have to work it out first. I said, no, let it grow, let it evolve. And so with the rivals, I just love the notion of plunging myself into a room in a hospice, imaginatively in my head, with somebody who was convinced that they were my rival for the last 40 years, and I had to make peace with them. And yet not knowing, having no clue who they were, what they had written, what our connection was. And I loved writing the story because I actually literally was sweating writing the story, saying, how in the name of God do I get out of this one, you know? And so as I think that the novels are written because one has to make a living, and the plays are written because one has to make a living. But I think like short stories don't sell much, and I really, really appreciate, and I'm honored that your book club are reading Secrets Never Told, and that they're finding a small audience in America, finding a small audience anywhere. So it's lovely. So the short stories were again written during the COVID lockdown, and suddenly there was no point in writing a new play, and there was nothing else. And very often they were forcibly written because the phone call came and the BBC wanted to play. But very often, when I wrote The Rivals first, say, the BBC phoned me up and said, we need a short story and we pay you this amount of money, and that was all grand. And then a BBC short story has to be like 2,100 words. That takes 15 minutes to read. And so you begin to tell the story, and then the characters take over in your imagination, and then suddenly you wind up that there's this story that's like 4,000 words long that hasn't really been fully fleshed out. And instead of actually writing the story to the end, you then begin cutting the story back because it has to fit these 15 minutes. So you wind up with sort of a radio version of the story, and then you wind up with sort of a version of the story that you were never quite happy with, and you never wound up finishing the story. So during COVID lockdown, I said, as a treat to myself, and hopefully some people will read them as well, I'm going to go back to all these short stories, and I'm going to finish, and I'm going to let the characters speak. And characters take characters. That's why I've said to the woman in the castle in Italy, like, don't just write the thing, because characters, you don't know your characters until they begin to speak to you. I remember like Colin McCann, that great Irish writer who lives in New York, telling me of one of his books. I think it was called This Side of Brightness. And it was set about the men who built the American, the subways in New York. And that there was a character in it called Dan or Con, lovely guy, and he gets killed. The tunnel collapses. And when Colin went back to his desk, having killed off this character, the other characters went on strike. They were sitting there, they were smoking farewell cigarettes, they had big placards up, and they had their big muddy boots on his desk. And nothing would happen for 4 or 5 days. And then he realized, actually, these characters know that this man is not meant to die in the story. This man is meant to be a big part of the story. Colin went back and actually sort of, made the accident that he was badly hurt, but he wasn't killed, and he lived on. And then the characters all stubbed out their cigarettes and took their boots down and got back to being characters. And very often, your subconscious, the characters in your subconscious know more than you do. And the art of writing is to allow those characters the space to actually take on whatever lives they're going to lead. And the exciting thing is when a character does something you're totally not expecting, and you are you just sit back looking at the computer and you say, where in the name of God did that come from? And that's real writing, when the characters mug you.
One of the other questions, which is kind of related to that, is that one of our people wanted to know that in several stories, the main character is a woman. Can you comment on the challenge of a male author writing in a woman's voice, and your ability to do this? Because I thought they were very successful.
Yeah,
All three
me
of us
too.
agree, thought, hey, he's right on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you look at the songs of Joni Mitchell, the first line cuts you to the heart, and she cuts to the emotional heart of this of the whatever she's writing about. And if you look at the love songs of Mr. Bruce Springsteen of America, of New York, America, he does that as well, but he does it in the third verse, and the first two verses are about his motor car. And now this is a slight exaggeration, but men are inclined to prevaricate and beat around the bush, and women are more intuitive and immediate in terms of their emotions. And I actually love to write in a woman's voice, because it creates a character that's totally outside myself. And sometimes it allows me to be quite autobiographical in a way that my first novel was called Night Shift. My first job was as a factory worker in a factory making welding rods, and Night Shift is the welding rods' sole contribution to world literature. It's the first and last novel ever about welding rods. And
the union must love you.
The character was very much like me. He was 18 years of age, but there was another guy in the factory. He was 19, and that chap had got his girlfriend pregnant, and was the way in the 70s. He had got married, and they were living in a caravan in Home Mother's Garden, and his life was more interesting than my life. So when I began to write Night Shift, I had some of my experience, but also I had a lot of his experience, because the story just took off in a way. But my late wife, when I met her for the first time, and Night Shift had just been published, and she used to talk, we were having conversations in pubs and out about meeting men, and the men were lovely, and then you discover they were married. And then she'd leave this long pregnant pause in the conversation, which went totally above my head. And then she told me years later that, just having read Night Shift, she presumed that I was married and had a first wife living in a caravan in Finnr. And she was allowing me the opportunity to tell this. And I said, no, but it's actually made up. The stuff is made up. But when you write in the first person, in a male point of view, people presume the character is you. So in some ways, there's the freedom to write in a woman's voice, allows you to, that people presume that it's not you. And also, I think that a writer, the process of writing should be as challenging as possible. So if you create a character who's totally unlike you, who's a different gender to you, different age to you, maybe a different class to you, that becomes really, really exciting, because you really have to work hard to get inside the head of the character. And so it prevents laziness. And sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. I remember I wrote a novel years ago called Father's Music. It's about a 23-year-old London punk girl who got up to all kinds of dodgy mischief, I figured out this was really, really out of my turf. So when I finished the book, I gave it to my niece to read, who was 23. I said, tell me what I'm really worried about this character. Tell me what I have wrong. And she gave me the book back and said, no, you have everything exactly right. And I said, oh, I'm no longer worried about the character, but I'm really worried about you. So you actually, it is trying to actually just get inside. And sometimes you get things right and sometimes you get things wrong. And women aren't slow telling you when you get things wrong.
Well, I know that question kind of bordered on with this kind of interesting theory of cultural appropriation, which is not something I totally comprehend the reason that, and I think that's why the person asked the question, that one.
Perhaps, but the other thing that you should know is that we decided we would put your collection of short stories back to back with a collection of short stories by Louise Kennedy,
Fine, right.
so that we have a man and a woman.
Mhm.
And what I was wondering is, when you read a short story, if you don't know who's written it, do you know whether it's a man or a woman?
No, no, you don't know. And I say that as somebody who, I sometimes people ask me about where's my role in Irish writing, and I'm sort of like the I've forgotten the word, Tom Hagen, the conciliary. I'm the conciliary of Irish writing. I operate quietly in the background, in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of enterprises. And one was that there's been an amazing forum called New Irish Writing for the last 50 years in Irish newspapers. It is a page in a national newspaper. It was began by the great David Marcus, who was a wonderful editor, and Kieran Carthy, my friend, has run it for the last 30 years. And for the last 30 years, I've been a ghost editor on New Irish Writing. And I will read the stories for Kieran, and I read them without knowing who's written them. I don't read them all. I read a short list every month, and occasionally the hair stands on the back of your neck. I remember reading like the first ever story published by Mike McCormack years and years ago, when the hair stand up, and the first story by Sarah Braun, who's really, really fine writer. And you literally don't, if it's a good story, the writer creates a fictional universe and you just go into it. I remember judging a thing on RTE called the Francis McMahon. It was basically, it's a national short story competition for the Irish Islands national television radio station. And other judges were Colin Tobin and Anne Enright. And one story stood out for us, and it was a story about a Brazilian who walked down in the fruit and vegetable markets in Dublin. And it could only have been written by a Brazilian, because he had everything so absolutely perfect. The whole sense of sort of leaving Buenos Aires and winding up in the fruit and vegetable markets, and sort of his view way of looking at the Irish people, and everything else. You just knew that this was, and I said, this is wonderful. This is a great story. Not only is it a great story, but also this is a great new voice in Irish writing. And when we opened the envelope, having given it, it was actually written by an Irish soldier based in the Curragh camp in the middle of Ireland. And I don't know how well you know Ireland, but the Curragh is the east of Ireland, least like Rio de Janeiro in the world, you know. But again, he was just a really, really good writer, and he got everything right. And he inhabited the world fully. And so not only do you not know if it's a man or woman, but you don't know their age. I mean, like, if you look at Dubliners by Joyce, I mean, he's incredibly young when he writes those stories, but he gets inside the head of people of all ages. And so I think writing is writing. And then there are different, cultural appropriation is a new word. When I was growing up, there was a thing called post-colonialism, it was called. That was it, yeah. And I used to think that what it was in Ireland, we had lots of priests in the foreign missions. And in the post office, there used to be a little sign, and it was all the dates that you could actually post the Christmas cards, and they would get to the foreign missions. You know what I mean? If you wanted to get to Australia, or whatever, And I was presumed until I was 31 that post-colonialism was actually the dates for the Christmas cards to go out of foreign missions. But it turned out to be something totally different altogether. But it was the craze for a long time, and loads of professors got wonderful extensions on their houses from the post-colonial conservatory and all these wonderful things. And then people forgot about it. And so as a writer, you just keep your head down and do what you do, which is right. And different trends, different fashions will come along. And but in the end, like Deista Mandelstam, who was Ossip Mandelstam's wife, said that a poet will spend his or her life 40, 50 years writing every day. And if they're lucky, they will be remembered for one poem or one verse of a poem or one line of a poem. And in the end, you just keep, you ignore fashion as much as possible. You just do what you do and hope that there'll be something you'll be remembered for, unlikely as it may seem.
But I said your point is well taken about it's kind of irrelevant whether it's a male or a female writer. It's the story and the work, if it's well written. But like Eugene McCabe's stories, like Tales of the Poorhouse, I mean, you would never know that that was written by a man. From a woman's perspective, two of the stories in there, and they're fantastic. And the way that you were able to capture the female in the doubt, you know, and one seed of doubt, you know, it's great. Yeah.
That's wonderful. One of the other questions is that came up or themes is that these stories seem to be as much about memory as about secrets. So why the title?
Memories never told wouldn't sell. I said, oh God, there's a book of short stories. I mean, my novels don't sell many to begin with. The short stories will sell none. And my sister June, who under the name of Laura Elliott sells around 40 times more books than I do, had a book called Secrets, something. She actually didn't. I just thought she had. When I asked, she said, no, I don't. But I just felt that it sounded a very mysterious title, and that I would make a desperate bid for late fame and a big audience and a phone call from Steven Spielberg by calling it Secrets Never Told, you know. But again, I forgot my place in Irish literature. My place in Irish literature is that Steven Spielberg phones me at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he says, Dermot, I love your work. And there's a question I've been meaning to ask you. Would you have Roddy Doyle's phone number? that was a small joke, by the way.
One of our other readers noticed that the happiest and most respected characters in these stories are those who seem to not care what others think. And he gives an example of Killian in The Last Person, John and Julie both at Coffee at 11, Simon the porter in Hotel Flanagan, and Charlie in What Then. Were these characters meant to make a larger point to your readers?
I think like someone like Martha in Martha Streets is a wonderfully independent person, and she was based on a woman called Sheila Fitzgerald. I wrote 2 novels about her. She was when I was 18, I hitchhiked around Ireland and I met this remarkable woman who was 73. And 73 seemed an impossibly old age. And she lived in a caravan. I began to buy the Irish Times to actually read a death notice in case she died. I just figured she wouldn't last much longer. She lived to be 99 years of age. So we a lot of copies of the Irish Times, I'll tell you, you know. And but I actually wrote 2 books about her life story. The last one was called An Arc of Light. The first one was exciting because her family, she was from sort of an Anglo-Irish family, and they got involved in communism in the 1930s, and one of her brothers died in a Soviet gulag, one of only 3 Irish people to die in the Soviet gulags, and the other brother was an ardent communist. And so the first half of the book, called The Family in Paradise Pier, was quite exciting in the sense to all these characters. And the second book was about her leaving her husband at the age of almost 50 and figuring that she had given up her happiness to make other people happy, and she was going off to try and discover who she was. And that book was called An Arc of Light, and I couldn't finish it. So as you do, I took one of the chapters when she's in a nursing home in Wexford, and I turned it into a short story because somebody phoned me up and asked me for a short story about James Joyce. And I actually, so it was, so something of the freedom of Sheila Fitzgerald is in that thing. I think that I love the couple in the Coffee at 11 who do have a serenity, but it's a very, very hard fought serenity. I think it's they've actually gone through so much to achieve that. They have found peace with each other, and there's I think in the first story, the chap does really care what other people think about him, but he just he's paralyzed by his own genius, by his own sense of genius, and I knew quite a lot of people like that in my 20s who were going to be the next great Irish writer, whose names mean nothing because they never got around to writing the book. I'm sure that also goes for the next great American writer and the next great New Zealand writer and everything else. You know, that people who actually, I was lucky that I just wasn't very talented, and I needed to work really hard. And sometimes if you have an abundance of genius, you think hard work is beneath you, and you just never get around to writing anything.
Would you say there's a theme to these short stories that you want the readers to do?
Not really, because there is, I mean, they are very, very different stories. They're written over a very, very long period of my life. The theme is that I wanted to put together all the little short fiction that I had written. And also I think they very often, the theme is that they're from things that intrigue me. There is a small town outside Dublin that I pass through occasionally. I've been passing through it for 10 years, and there are flowers on the same telegraph pole that must be changed every second or third day. I've never passed that in 10 years without seeing those same flowers there, and it's directly outside someone's front door. And you sort of, you just become very, very intrigued by the notion of a public space. And, and can somebody, no matter how great their grief is, colonize a public space and make it into a shrine of mourning, and how people of a certain generation bore their grief in private, and people of another generation seem to need to broadcast their grief. And so the team, what links the stories, that they all come out of these small little things that I've seen. And I said, like, this isn't a novel. I don't want to write a novel. I don't want to know all the things, but I want to find out what it feels like to have your life interrupted by someone else's grief, or to actually sort of go up, like, in a really poor West of Ireland background, slowly build yourself up so you've achieved a sense of peace and equilibrium and respect miles away from your past, and then have your past suddenly intrude upon you and refuse to be a victim. And so all these, the teams were really just, they were just in the long evenings of COVID lockdown. And in Dublin at one stage, you couldn't move beyond 2 kilometers of your house, and then it was 5 kilometers. I just sat here and I let these stories that had never really been finished. But Picasso was once asked, when was a painting finished? And he said, when the gentleman from the gallery comes to hang it. And as a playwright, a play is only ever finished when the gentlemen and ladies from the press come to hang the playwright. And as a short story writer, they're never finished. So this time I'm going to actually finish them, and it's part of putting your life in order as well. But when you get to a certain age, I'm not that I'm likely to keel over during this Zoom call, but you do suddenly say, if I were to be knocked down by a bus or hit by a golf ball, it would be nice if my sons didn't have to go through 47 drafts of these short stories to actually figure out where the book was. So it was a case of really just trying to create this, all those stories that I'd lived in my imagination for years and never been finished, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Another question is from one of our readers was, there is a good deal of foreshadowing about how the ending will go. What is the appeal of the twist at the end?
Oh, you're going to have to, I don't like speaking about personal trauma, because I think a writer's life should be private, but there was a terrible trauma in my life called 1970s music, and it left me slightly deaf. So could you repeat the question again, please? We can blame, there's a long list of bands I could blame, but I won't go into them now,
Our reader, one of our other group members, asked me to ask you, or say there's a good deal of foreshadowing about how the ending will go. What is the appeal of the twist at the end?
I think I like stories that have twists in them. Now, I don't like stories, I don't like the twists are a gimmick, but what I like about, say, the story that people ask me most about in Secrets Never Told is One Seed of Doubt. And I love, and again, it was amazing, just cast myself into a situation of, she follows the woman into the little Italian restaurant, and what's their conversation going to be? And as a writer, because I had no idea what these two women would say to each other and how it would go. And then I just love the fact that at the end of it, when everything seemed resolved, nothing was resolved. And I think if nothing is resolved, the reader will bring the short story with them. And that, your book club, when they meet, and they don't have to like these stories or anything else, they will hopefully all have different views on how that story ends or what actually happens next. And so I think that if you finish something totally, there's no room for the reader. And I think if there's a twist, it leaves space imaginatively for the story to leave your imagination And if you're lucky, go into the imagination of the reader, and for the reader to speculate then and bring it in a new direction. And I think it's almost like a passing over of the ownership of the story, if that makes any sense.
Mhm. Yeah, that's kind of what I agree. I in other groups, I've heard people say, but I want to know what happened. And I thought, no, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It leads you to think about it.
Mhm.
And some of the other questions, and I don't know if each of you did, but we'd like to know what are some of your favorite contemporary writers, whether Irish or of other nationalities, and what it is, if you've got some favorites, what it is about their writing that appeals to you?
As you age, you relate to writers differently. And the actual so when we I remember like first reading James Joyce when I was like 18 and being extraordinarily disappointed that Ulysses wasn't a dirty book. I now read a 63 and know that it is a dirty book, you know, but you actually, but it was almost like nowadays I have a small, neat, good Irish whiskey before bed. When I was 21, I couldn't drink whiskey. And in the same way, with certain types of literature, you need to reach a certain age for that book to actually appeal to you, that book to resonate or work through. So I respect all writers who can make a living with just the thin sliver of their imagination. The majority of reading I do is actually nonfiction, because as a writer, each of my books have been very, very different. And I'm rewriting a book at the moment called A Second Life, which was the first book about the Magdalen laundries and the practice of adoption in Ireland, and also set in the Botanic Gardens. I remember like there was a time I knew everything about the history of Dublin's Botanic Gardens, and when I was writing The Family in Paradise Pier, there's at least one shelf of books behind me that to do with Stalinist Russia and things, and then you're like an actor. Actors are extraordinary in that they remember an entire play, and then they forget the entire play to remember the next play. And so a huge amount. I read surprisingly little fiction, but I do. But I do love Anne Enright for her the sharpness of her language, and I like David Park, who's another very, very fine writer, Irish writer who's rather neglected. And I actually like people who are able to say things in a very, very concise and compacted way that makes me catch my breath.
Okay. So do you have a list of books that you plan to read in the near future?
Whatever comes through letterbox, because actually London publishers send me books around 6 months before they're published, and to the dismay of my postman who generally knocks at my door and has his similar line, "Not another feckin' book," as he hands me something like that I've carried from the post office. So I actually I'm actually in a bit like when I read the short stories for new Irish writing, they're not published for another like 8-9 months, and I've forgotten it, you know. And so I'm actually reading a lot of fiction that's due out next year, and you know, some of it I'm really enjoying it, and some of it I'm enjoying less, you know.
Dermot, what are you working on now?
I am. What am I working on now? Yeah, I have a little book of poems called "Other People's Lives" that is being published in 2 weeks' time that I wrote during lockdown. And also I have. It's funny. I wrote a novel called "A Second Life" when I was 32, and I was married. I had 2 very small children, aged 3 and aged 6 months, and I began to write a book about about someone who's in a near-death experience, or has an out-of-body experience in a car crash. And at that time, women for the first time in Ireland began to talk about their experience of adoption and the Magdalen laundries and everything else. And I wrote, the novel became about that, but I didn't feel that I got it right. And so I'm actually it's coming out again. It's been out of print for many years, and I have rewritten a lot of it. I mean, playwrights often rewrite their plays, like Tom Murphy's plays are often quite radically changed, and so something like Derek Mann changed his poems on a regular basis. Novelists really do. and but there's a wonderful. I have a great friend called Jennifer Johnson, who be probably my favorite Irish novelist, really, really fine writer, and a great friend to me over the years. And I remember she had a one-woman show that Rosalyn Lenihan, who's one of Ireland's most famous actresses, was doing in a little small theatre at the Peacock to half a house on a Tuesday lunchtime. And she came out on stage. The set was just one chair. And she sat down, she said the first two lines, and then she looked at us, the audience, and she says, I think I got off on the wrong foot. Do you mind if I start again? And she got up and left the theatre, walked out the exit, came back on and began again. And she was actually brilliant. And I met her years later, and she said, that only ever happened once in my life. And I said, but I thought it was actually brilliant. And in the same way, with this new version of A Second Life, I'm saying I got off on the wrong foot and I didn't have the actual courage to stop. And so I've spent the last couple of months rewriting that, and I am going to Paris to write a new play in May, I think. And I'm doing, and one bits of my imagination is a bit unruly and has a mind of its own. So I might wake up at 2:30 tonight and discover that I'm writing a new novel. But I actually really want to hoover the house, because I've written an awful lot of books in recent times, and the house is falling down. You know.
It's interesting you mentioned that the novel that you're reworking on, the Madeline Laundries, because the book that we had last month for our book club was Patricia Bergman's play Eclipsed. And that's what we
that's right, yes. Which really was the first piece of writing about it. Although I think there was Hannah Board's Nest Soup, which wasn't quite about Madeline Laundrie, was about being an institution. But that's a very fine play. That really was groundbreaking in its day, you know.
Yeah. Last Sunday's New York Times book review, the front page had two Irish authors' books. One was the Finnr Tool, a history of Nora South, and the other one is short stories by Roddy Doyle. So.
Oh yeah.
Both of which are sitting on my coffee table at home as we speak. Talking about our own.
I was talking to Finton's wife yesterday, and he has a grandson in Stockholm, and in Copenhagen, who calls him Finnr, which is Finnish for father of my father. And I just don't know. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to take his books seriously again as I think of Finnr. But they're two lovely. They're two very nice people to have on any review of books, because they're two gentlemen, you know.
But I was just saying, Mary, to your point about that, about having two Irish writers on the cover of the New York Times book review, that's great. And it's so hard to get attention, I think. I mean, can you speak to that? Like, because there's so many fine writers in Ireland, including yourself, who I think should be better known over here. And a lot of writers aren't. And then there's a couple that seem to, everybody knows about. And I don't know if that's a function of their publishers or just economics or what. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Some writers, I mean, like, if you come to Ireland and if you stop somebody on the street and ask them who their favorite poet is, they'll say Patrick Kavanagh. And Patrick Kavanagh, he was a farmer, small farmer and shoemaker from a small farm in Monaghan, who wrote and who really connected with Irish people, but who never traveled. He never had those sort of themes that people expect in Irish writing. And so he actually sort of was somebody who was very important in the same way as John McGowan was a hugely important figure who I think his greatest book amongst women sold like 1,300 copies in America when it was published. And like almost, was like sold massive numbers in Ireland. And sometimes writers travel and sometimes they don't, and that has nothing to do with our merits, because writers of equal merit travel, and sometimes it's the work, and sometimes it's the look at the draw as well, and that is so it can be a combination of having been a publisher myself. It is interesting, the things I remember, like publishing Nuala Phelan's I Use Somebody, and having a big row with my partner because he wanted to print 3,000 and I said no, 2.5. And then she was just on, there was a show in Ireland called The Late Late Show with Gay Bone, and she was on the Gay Bone show. She was on the Late Show, and I just knew this is going to sell 50,000 copies because the interview was electric. And suddenly it was #2 in the New York Times bestsellers, Nuala's memoir, and it was published in France and all kinds of places. And yet reading the manuscripts, there was nothing to suggest that book would actually take off, but it just rang a bell. Her loneliness, her sense of vulnerability, her sense of searching for herself, all resonated with all kinds of people, and she was flooded with letters from all over the world by women writing to her, and she enjoyed this wonderful benediction of 10 years of fame before her life was tragically cut short. And you just couldn't, if you can't sit down and decide what's going to be a bestseller, because you will never get it right. Certain books resonate with certain people at certain times, and that's just the look at the door. And as a writer, you've got to say, when I was growing up in Finnr, my brother was a great footballer. I remember like winning a thing called the Hennessy Prize and coming back, and there were 3 rather rough looking skinheads sitting on a windowsill outside a fish and chip shop in Finnr, and they went very, very silent as I was approached, and that's not generally a good sign actually when there's skinheads. And actually they just looked at me in silence, and as I went around the corner, I heard one of them say really, really sadly, I wouldn't mind, but his brother was a great footballer. And so success in Finnr wasn't really winning. If it was actually playing football,
Yeah.
And if you are a good footballer, this is a soccer analogy, but it doesn't really matter in some ways if you make a living playing for Manchester United, who are a very famous team, or Macclesfield Town, who are a very unfamous team. The notion of making a living from your football boots is a boy's dream. And when I was, a factory worker in Finnr, the notion of making a living from my imagination was the dream that I never thought would actually happen. So sometimes books are very, very successful. Sometimes books that are equally good and not successful, and you just have to go with the flow. And I have managed to knock out a living and raise a family with this thin sliver of my imagination, and that's great. And you never know if certain things will take off in years to come, or certain things won't. Unfortunately, poems and novels don't get used as a background music in in ads for Levi jeans, which is the way that a lot of musicians suddenly find themselves famous.
That's interesting, because one of the things that Joyce and I have to think about when we select books for the book discussion, there may be a title we just love, and then we find out it's going to be so difficult for our group to find copies of it. What authors and titles would you recommend for the Irish group here in Phoenix to read? Other than yours, of course, which we do.
Actually, there's a wonderful book called A Quiet Tide by Marianne Lee, and it's about somebody who was it doesn't sound very exciting, but it's beautifully written. I love the fact that there was no fireworks, there was no, it's about a real life botanist at the start of the 19th century who lived down in Bantry in West Cork, and was very much just sent at her brother's will to mind the family home, to do this, and went out and collected all these extraordinary specimens of plants and sent them to people in London whom she never met, and about her interior life. And I think it's a really, really fine book by a writer who, the book was published during the pandemic and never sort of got the attention it actually deserved, And there's a few other books that I will email you the titles, because there's a number of other books published by, there's a lot of really good male and female new writers coming out of Ireland that might be interesting to look at,
Thank you.
What question for you is that when you're interviewed, as you are now, what questions do you like to be asked, and what are your least favorite ones?
Well, the question I always like to be asked is is this your real hair? But no one's ever asked that question, unfortunately.
What were we thinking?
Is that your real hair, Dermot?
And I'm not sure I have any question that that I mind being asked, to be honest with you, because I actually love when people out of curiosity, and it's extraordinary the things you do as a writer that you be in. I remember like reading poems in like a park in Beijing on St. Patrick's Day 12 years ago in the snow, watched by an audience of bored acrobats on stilts smoking cigarettes in the background, because they were hired to be there, a handful of dignitaries and around 200 secret policemen and Chinese television. And you go from that strange thing to being asked to go into a classroom of 8-year-olds. And I said, oh, good Jesus, what am I going to say to a classroom of 8-year-olds? And you walk in and you've gone through all your books, and you realize that you will be jailed immediately if you read one single word any of your novels to a class of 8-year-olds. And you walk in, and then you put stuff in, and you walk in, and there's just a sea of hands, and they say, how much money do you make every year? and so kids just ask questions. So literally, one as a writer, one Flann O'Brien, Miles de Goppeline, Bruno Nolan, I heard many names. He said that the sign of a good university education was that a person should be able to make a break of 20 on a snooker table, no matter how bad the surface. And I think the sign of being a reasonable, experienced writer is that one should be able to be prepared for every question that comes at you.
I don't know if the pandemic ever ends in travel. And any plans that you would travel to the US and maybe travel to Phoenix and visit us here?
Well, I for the last 2 years, I have been trying to vary my travel and make it very exotic. There's 2 supermarkets and about 10 minutes different directions, and I alternate between them, and I call this excitement, you know. So there's also the excitement of having 2 digestive biscuits with my Horlicks in the evenings. But if the pandemic ends and I do get to America again, I will certainly bear it in mind. I meant to go over to receive some prize in America, but again, with the Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Prize, and but I think the 2020 winner, I'm the 2021 winner and the 2022 winner, none of us going. So I was saying to the organizer that he should, like, we have an island, we have these St. Patrick's Day parades, and there's all these floats go by. And I think that when the pandemic ends, he should just put all the winners of the Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Award on a float and just have them going through the town, all reading their poems and playing harp at the same time. But this suggestion didn't seem to go down well for some reason, you know.
Anything else you'd like to share with us?
Oh, if you would like, I will read I will read one poem. Would that be nice
Yes,
to finish up? And because it's a library, and because when I left the welding rod factory, I became a library assistant. And I can say with great pride that I was the worst library assistant in the history of Dublin County Council. And I was banished to the Siberian salt mines of the mobile libraries, to the Spence largesse of romance books and cookery books, to the populace of small seaside towns, and which was a very, very pleasant way to spend several years of my life wandering around a mobile library with a naked gas ring, boiling a kettle of water at high speed on the laneways of Dublin. And my favorite borrower she was 91 years of age. And her name was Isabella Lucinda Bright. And she used to live on the far side of a golf course called Corbelis in Donabate in Dublin. And the local farmer would give her a lift to the library on the back of his tractor. And so I want to thank you all for asking me these questions, and for also you and the book club for picking secrets never told. And I really hope you enjoy it, and I really hope that you don't all enjoy it, so that you all have a row and there are bottles of wine spilt, and that somebody goes for somebody's throat with a leaf from it, because that's always the sign of a very good book club. You know, when the cheese gets thrown, the book club is good. You know, that's my theory, at least, and I could be wrong. And I finished with this little poem from other people's lives, and it's for It's called A Sonnet for Isabella Lucinda Bright. On the edge of nowhere, the mobile library stops. After dusk in January, beside a seaside golf course. Surely nobody awaits us on such a stormy night. But a tiny hand appears once we open the door. Arthritic fingers gripping the rail sufficiently tight to let us slowly ascend steep steps into the van. Having accepted a lift on the back of a tractor from a house between the links and seashore, radiant at 91, Isabella Lucinda Bright bestows a weekly greeting on us library staff, her zest and energy banishing the wintry dark, as she asks, as usual, for 2 detective novels. And if we have anything by Samuel Beckett, because his mordant wit still makes her laugh. Folks, it's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Dermot.
Light on, but I do look brighter than this in daylight, you know.
Thank you very much, Dermot. I
Thank you
really
all very much.
appreciate it.
It's been a huge pleasure meeting you all.
Okay.
I hope to one day get to Phoenix, you know.
Bye.
Thank you, Dermot.
Cheers
Take
now.
care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
Very well.
Sorry, you did great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now what do I do?
Yeah, she did very well, didn't she?
Thank you.
That was great. Yeah, but I think it was so important that you shared the questions